You know, for all the profound wisdom that you find in ancient spiritual teachings, sometimes the most famous pieces of advice just sound completely, utterly impractical.
Right.
I mean, for the world we actually live in, it's not just that they sound naive, but if you actually followed them, word for word, maybe even dangerous.
Well, we're talking about those core instructions, right? The ones that are like the anchor of entire traditions.
Exactly.
But when you filter them through our modern lens, competitive, high-stakes life, they really do seem like a recipe for getting exploited or just failing. It's a real friction point for a lot of people.
Absolutely. The two that always stick out for me are the ones attributed to Jesus. Turn the other cheek, and if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also.
The classics.
Yeah. I mean, if you read that as straight tactical advice for, say, high-stakes business negotiation or even just defending your family, it sounds like an invitation to become a complete doormat, a casualty. How do we even begin to square that with our basic instincts for self-preservation?
Well, that tension, that exact feeling of absurdity you're pointing to, is precisely the fundamental error in perspective that our sources are urging us to reframe.
An error in perspective.
Yes. The ego, the separated self, it reads these as rules it has to follow. But they are not tactical rules for the ego to obey. They're not a strategy of suppression. They are, in fact, they're ontological descriptions.
Ontological descriptions. Okay, you have to unpack that for us.
They describe how a person naturally acts when they're no longer operating from that defended, fragmented, separate ego. In that state, which we can call unity consciousness, giving away your possessions or refusing to retaliate isn't a forced moral choice you have to make.
It's not an act of willpower.
Not at all. It's simply the path of least resistance. It's what you do when you realize there is no isolated self to defend in the first place, and therefore, nothing truly to lose.
So the goal isn't to suppress my natural urge to fight back, which, I mean, that sounds exhausting.
And brittle.
Incredibly brittle. The goal is to reach a state where that urge just doesn't come up. It doesn't arise because the whole me versus you drama has dissolved at a foundational level. That's a massive shift.
It is the ultimate shift. And this reinterpretation, seeing these sayings as descriptors of a future evolutionary state, is deeply, deeply aligned with the contemplative heart of virtually every major tradition. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack this developmental thesis. We'll look at why conflict is functional, how this blueprint is universal, and most importantly, what the practical path looks like for you as an individual to move from that state of friction to one of effortless alignment, or what the Taoists would call wu-wei.
Okay, let's do it. I think we have to start with this idea you mentioned, this really radical idea that the friction we all experience every single day is in fact functional. So let's really hammer home this ontological versus tactical distinction, because it feels like the key that unlocks everything else.
It is.
When the separate self, the ego, hears turn the other cheek, it hears a command. And that command feels like spiritual self-annihilation.
Exactly. It thinks, you're telling me I have to let myself be harmed, to be depleted, controlled.
And that's terrifying. Because the ego's primary job is to draw and defend boundaries.
That's its whole function. So it interprets this advice as a strategy of self-denial, of suppression.
Yeah.
It thinks it has to actively fight that instinct for retaliation, and that creates this massive internal stress.
Right. But the mystic or the sage, someone living from a non-dual place, they've already moved beyond that framework.
Completely. So they hear that same advice, turn the other cheek, and what they hear is, there is no isolated self to defend in the first place. The premise is different.
But I'm still struggling with this. If someone hits me physically or, metaphorically with a verbal attack, how does the response become irrelevant? Doesn't the pain of that blow, force a reaction?
So the blow forces a response, but not necessarily an egoic reaction. There's a difference. When that framework of me versus you has dissolved, retaliation doesn't even enter the menu of valid possibilities. It's not that you suppress it. It's made irrelevant. It's like trying to suppress the urge to fly off the earth right now.
Gravity just makes it a non-issue.
Gravity makes that urge irrelevant, yeah. And the framework of unity consciousness acts as a kind of psychological and spiritual gravity. Your action or your non-action flows from the recognition that the other person is acting from fragmentation. But their fragmentation doesn't need to define or fragment you.
This suggests a totally different kind of power then, because the separate self uses coercive power, fist meeting fist. It's an attempt to dominate to win. But the state you're describing, it sounds like it operates on inclusive power.
That is the core asymmetry. Coercive power depends on resistance. It depends on mirrored hostility to define its own reality.
It needs something to push against.
It needs something to push against. Inclusive power, on the other hand, it absorbs the opposing force without needing to defend a boundary. Think of the ocean again. Imagine a single wave driven by a storm representing opposition or conflict, and that wave is trying to surprise or defeat the main body of the water.
It's impossible. The ocean doesn't resist. It just absorbs it.
Exactly. The ocean absorbs the wave because the wave was always fundamentally a part of the ocean. So when a person operating from separation tries to oppose a sage, someone aligned with unity, their action just doesn't meet the resistance they expect.
There's no hook.
There's no isolated ego boundary to hook into, and because of that, the aggressor's action fails to achieve its primary goal, which is to pull the sage into a reciprocal, dualistic narrative of conflict.
I need to challenge this because it sounds a little bit like we're saying the sage becomes magically invulnerable. If I, operating from my own separate angry self, physically assault this sage, what doesn't work then? I mean, I can still cause physical harm, right?
This is a crucial point. And we have to maintain what the sources call the crucial safeguard,
Right.
avoiding level confusion.
A level confusion. Okay.
What doesn't work is domination, psychological control, or achieving an ego-based victory. Your action cannot define the sage's reality or destabilize their core existential alignment. The sage remains inside the larger movement of unity while you believe you're outside of it, fighting.
So their center holds. The core of who they are is untouched.
Yes.
But as we see with Jesus on the cross or the historical accounts of the Buddha being poisoned, unity consciousness does not grant you supernatural physical dominance. It doesn't make you invulnerable in the world of physical forms. They can still be physically harmed or even killed.
Precisely.
Yes.
Unity changes how the event is lived. It's lived without existential threat, without psychological opposition, without bitterness, but it does not negate the physical reality of the event itself. If we fall into that trap, suggesting unity grants some kind of magical control or physical immunity, we are just substituting one form of egoic desire, the desire for control over outcomes, for another. The ultimate surrender is recognizing that life and death are themselves part of that larger flow.
That actually makes the power far more profound. It's not about manipulating the world around you. It's about transforming your relationship to the world.
That's it.
And that leads perfectly into the second part of this whole idea, that the very existence of conflict, this fallen world, is actually necessary scaffolding.
So if the end goal is unity consciousness, the obvious question is, why did the universe begin with such painful separation?
Yeah, why the detour?
Our sources suggest we have to reframe the whole idea of sin. We need to stop viewing the fall as, a historical moral crime the moment humans broke a rule, and instead see it as an ontological misalignment.
An ontological misalignment.
It's a fundamental misrecognition of unity.
So it's not a moral stain. It's more like a structural error in perception.
Yes, exactly. And this is why the original Greek meaning of sin, hamartia, is so insightful. It literally means missing the mark, like an arrow missing the bullseye.
So it's an error of aim, not necessarily an act of, pure wickedness.
Right. And this maps so cleanly onto avidya, which means ignorance in Vedanta and Buddhism. The suffering of the world is rooted not so much in evil deeds, but in this fundamental ignorance of our true interconnected nature.
Okay, but why is this misrecognition functional? Why would a whole complete universe alienate itself into millions and billions of separate, struggling egos?
Because that illusion of separation is the engine required for the emergence of self-reflective awareness. We can see a parallel here, a pretty strong one, to the Hegelian dialectic.
Okay.
The universe, or spirit, alienates itself. It forgets its own unity, which is the fall, in order to freely and consciously rediscover it at a higher, more integrated level. That's the synthesis.
That's a pretty deep concept. Can you give us maybe a human scale analogy for that?
Sure. Think about independence. A child is born in a state of utter dependence. That's an innocent, initial kind of unity.
Right, with the parent.
Exactly. To achieve true maturity, they have to enter a period of alienation adolescence, leaving home, defining themselves against the parent. That's the separation and conflict phase. If they eventually choose to return to the parent or to the principles the parent embodied, that relationship is no longer dependent.
It's a chosen, conscious, free unity.
It is. The conflict, the separation, that was the necessary journey for free choice and a deep appreciation to emerge. Without it, you're just stuck in dependency.
So you're saying conflict and suffering aren't some cosmic bug that needs fixing?
They're not a bug, they're a feature.
They are the conditions, the pressure on the sandpaper required for the diamond of self-awareness to form. A universe that never forgot its own unity could never freely rediscover it.
Exactly. Friction is functional. If everything were just flow all the time, we would be nothing more than components in a machine. We would lack the capacity for conscious, free choice and self-awareness. It's the necessity of fighting through conflict that refines consciousness and makes that final realization of unity so profound.
That brings up a necessary, but I think a difficult ethical question. If conflict and suffering are necessary for our collective development, how do we, as individuals seeking unity, avoid spiritual bypassing? Are we just trying to escape our evolutionary duty by seeking wu-wei or the elimination of internal friction?
That is the critical challenge, you're right. And we have to address it. The goal is not to abolish conflict prematurely. It's to transform our relationship to it.
Okay.
A sage operating from unity recognizes the developmental necessity of conflict in the collective. And that's why they can't just wave a magic wand and force global peace. Forcing unity onto a world that isn't ready for it would violate the logic of development. It would actually be a form of violence itself.
So the sage doesn't eliminate friction for the whole world, but they model a transformed relationship to it.
Precisely. Figures like Jesus. They're not describing how the world is. They are pointing to a future attractor of consciousness, a mode of being that's not yet globally stabilized. Their wisdom spreads by resonance, by the sheer gravity of their internal alignment, not by coercion. They respect the developmental stage that we're in, which is why their teachings are received as paradoxes by the struggling ego.
They incarnate within the collective dream, accepting its terms, in order to show us the way out. That suggests that these spiritual attractors, these ultimate goals, they must share a common map across the traditions if they are all describing the same future state.
They do, and this is where the sources reveal something that is truly astonishing. When we strip away all the cultural context, the specific prophets, the mythology, the architecture of the destination is identical. This shared teleology, this shared ultimate purpose suggests this is an archetypal truth embedded in human experience itself.
Okay, so let's ground this. This idea of a cross-traditional convergence. Let's look at the textual evidence, starting with, say, the Jewish tradition's vision of a future harmony.
We can turn to the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 11.9. He describes a world where they will neither harm nor destroy, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
And the key word there is knowledge.
The key word is knowledge, dat, in Hebrew. And this isn't rote obedience to rules. It's not religious dogma. Dat implies a deep, direct, experiential, participatory knowing.
So violence ends not because God enforces some new divine police state,
Right.
but because consciousness itself is saturated with the direct knowing of the unity of reality. Harming someone else becomes unthinkable because everyone knows on a gut level that they're harming themselves.
Exactly. The need for moral rules just dissolves when perception shifts. And Christianity echoes this centuries later in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, describing a new heaven and a new earth. And in this new reality, God dwelling with humanity means the complete collapse of the divine and human barrier. No more tears, no more pain, because the existential separation that was causing the pain in the first place is gone.
And we see this theme repeat so robustly in Eastern thought as well.
In Hinduism, the present age is the Kali Yuga. It's chaotic, it's fragmented. The arrival of the final avatar, Kalki, is described as ending this cycle and ushering in the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, perfection, and harmony. It's an ontological reset based on alignment with eternal law, or dharma.
And in Buddhism?
Similarly, in Buddhism, the future Buddha, Maitreya, appears when the collective consciousness has sufficiently ripened. And that leads to a profound reorganization of society around compassion and insight.
The pattern absolutely holds. In all these major cases, the end of suffering and violence doesn't come through stricter moral suppression.
No.
It comes through a saturation with knowing. A fundamental collective shift in perception that dissolves the illusion of separation. It's a cognitive evolution.
And this evolutionary goal, it relies on a shared underlying structure of reality, a metaphysical mechanism that allows for unity to fragment and then reunite. And this is what we're calling the cosmic operating system.
Okay, so lay out this universal template for us. The sources are mapping a three-layered metaphysical structure that underlies all of these grand systems.
Right. The first layer is layer one, the source, the Father. This is the infinite, unmanifested, utterly changeless potentiality. It's the unconditioned ground of all being.
Yeah.
In Christian Trinitarian terms, this is God the Father, the origin point. And this maps cleanly onto Nirguna Brahman in Vedanta. That's Brahman without attributes, utterly unqualified beyond human conception.
The silence, the ultimate mystery.
Yes. It's the Tao in Taoism, the ultimate ineffable source. It's Ein Sof without limit in Kabbalah and Aldat, the essence, in Sufism. Think of it like the blank screen of a movie projector, just pure potential, pure stillness.
And then layer 2 is where things start to take shape. Layer 2, the pattern, the logos.
This is the ordering principle. It's the structural information, the total manifested word that brings order to all that potentiality. If layer 1 is the source, layer 2 is the blueprint.
The architecture.
The architecture. In Christian terms, this is Christ, the Son, the Logos made flesh, the Word through whom all things were made. It's the structure and intelligence of the cosmos.
And how does that translate to the other traditions?
It maps onto Ishvara, or Saguna Brahman. That's with attributes. The creative aspect in Hinduism, it's the Te in Taoism, the virtue, the specific nature or pattern of a thing, and it's alakal, the universal intellect in Islamic philosophy. If the source is the blank screen, the pattern is the detailed script, the storyboard, the code.
Which brings us to the third layer, which is what makes everything move and breathe. Layer 3, the dynamic flow, the spirit.
This is the animating energy. It's the relational process that actualizes the pattern. This is the Holy Spirit, the immanent presence of the divine, the energy that connects and sustains all things.
And the parallels here.
It maps directly onto Shakti, or prana in Hinduism, the dynamic creative energy. It's chi, the vital energy in Taoism. And it's the Shekinah in Jewish mysticism, the divine presence dwelling in the world. It's the executable file. It's the power that takes the static script of layer 2 and runs it across the blank potential of layer 1.
Now, this is where we have to address what feels like a tricky philosophical stunt. The Holy Spirit is traditionally defined as a distinct, co-eternal person. But this mystical mapping we're doing sees it as a fluid, emergent process, something like the Tao. So how do we reconcile personality with process?
We can use the concept of strong emergence. Strong emergence is when a system, while it's completely dependent on its fundamental components, develops new properties that you cannot predict or reduce back to the properties of those components alone.
Okay, give us a simple analogy to make that abstract idea a bit more accessible.
Think of water, H2O, at different stages. The source, layer 1, is the fundamental potential, the molecules themselves. The pattern, layer 2, is the fixed structure, the molecular bonds, the rules of chemistry. Now you introduce flow, layer 3. When you heat water, it becomes steam. Steam is still fundamentally H2O, but it gains entirely new emergent properties. It can drive a piston, it can become invisible, it can fill an entire room.
I see. You couldn't predict the functional power of steam just by studying the molecular structure of liquid water?
Exactly. The spirit is the emergent process of manifestation. In its operations, its ability to teach, guide, and intercede is described in Scripture. It exhibits personal, relational qualities. That's the person.
Right.
But its essential function is the dynamic, continuous process of flow. That's the Tao. So this allows the mystical intuition of flow to harmonize with the traditional need for a relational God. The spirit is the aspect of God that fully enters the system and animates it from within.
This cosmic map is incredibly powerful, but it does rely on an assumption that we've reached a high developmental stage. And before we rush into the synthesis and the individual path, we need to return to that critical safeguard you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
The importance of justice, specifically the Islamic concept of mizan.
This is absolutely vital. If we try to impose unity conceptually, just saying, oh, it's all one, before we've resolved injustice and inequity experientially, we produce something called pseudo-unity.
And what does pseudo-unity look like in the real world?
It's a profound danger. Pseudo-unity is any system. It could be a political movement, a corporate culture, a religious sect that suppresses difference, demands conformity, and uses the comforting language of oneness and love and light to mass domination and structural inequity.
That sounds like classic spiritual bypassing, using high-minded concepts to ignore real trauma, real conflict, or just the immediate need for ethical accountability.
Precisely. And this is why Islam's emphasis on mizan, which means balance, justice, the scale, is the necessary bridge. Mizan ensures that the rules of separation are honored while separation still exists. Justice is the necessary scaffolding required in a fragmented world.
So when separation is real, rules and accountability are paramount.
They're paramount.
So justice is the anti-shortcut. It stops us from leaping from the thesis of separation straight to a false synthesis, skipping that necessary antithesis of ethical maturation.
True unity has to be earned. It's earned through rigorous ethical development, through accountability, and through the internal struggle of self-purification, which is sometimes called jihad al-nafs. The world needs to exhaust the painful logic of separation, the consequences of injustice, before it can truly enter that age of effortless flow. Even in Islamic eschatology, the figures of the Mahdi and Jesus are described as restoring mizan, restoring justice before the era of peace begins. It stresses that moral rectification has to precede true, stable unity.
That grounding makes the entire path so much more robust. It means that seeking internal alignment doesn't excuse us from engaging ethically with the world's friction. We have to build a strong, accountable, ethical self before we can even attempt to dissolve that self into the universal flow. So if the collective has to struggle through this dialectic of conflict, how does the individual apply this universal map? We're moving from the grand cosmic operating system down to the nuts and bolts of daily life. And the practical path starts with probably the most demanding and seemingly painful symbol there is, the cross.
Right. The injunction is to pick up your cross daily. And if we take that as a mandate for perpetual suffering, it's just demoralizing.
Of course.
But if we reframe the cross using that Hegelian dialectic again, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it becomes the engine of individual growth.
Yeah.
Not a punishment. It is strictly scaffolding, a temporary structure for development.
So let's break down the geometry of the cross as a dialectic that we carry every day.
The vertical beam is the thesis. This is your grounded ethical self, your deepest values, your best intentions for how you want to act, your spiritual alignment. It anchors you.
Okay.
The horizontal beam is the antithesis. This is life's friction, the conflicts, the limitations, the sudden challenges, anything that cuts across and opposes your intended vertical path.
And so carrying the cross is the synthesis.
It is the conscious, active engagement with that tension. It's about integrating the friction without an egoic reaction. So instead of collapsing under the conflict or escalating it, you hold that tension consciously. You use the external pressure to refine your internal structure. This daily practice is what builds the maturity and resilience you need to graduate to the next stage.
Can you give us a tangible modern example? Let's say I face an unfair personal attack at work. The cross isn't just the pain of the criticism itself.
No. The vertical beam is your commitment to integrity and professionalism. The horizontal beam is that unfair attack, the temptation to lash out or the urge to just quit immediately. Carrying the cross is the conscious choice to pause, to integrate whatever truth might be in it, if there is any, to discard the venom, and then to respond with ethical clarity instead of reactive hostility. It's the moment you choose a response over a visceral reaction.
And crucially, the goal is not to stay on the cross forever.
Absolutely not. The cross is scaffolding. The goal is liberation. The suffering is functional only insofar as it creates awareness. The goal is to reach that new earth state where the cross is no longer needed, because the individual has integrated that friction so thoroughly that the tension itself dissolves. The scaffolding falls away when the structure is complete. Now, this conscious work of carrying the cross, it eventually matures into a practice that requires less deliberate effort and more alignment. And this is the Taoist turn. This is adopting the lowest position.
The lowest position. Okay, that sounds suspiciously like turning to a doormat again. How is this any different from that naive advice we started with?
It's entirely different. The lowest position is often misunderstood as passivity, but it's not. It is alignment with the universal flow, like water. Water always takes the lowest position. It yields to the terrain. And yet, over time, its adaptable power can wear down the strongest rock. The ego wants to be the mountain. The sage seeks to be the water.
So it's about non-egoic effectiveness, not performative opposition. If we're talking about fight of systemic injustice, the ego might push for a flashy, confrontational escalation.
Right.
But the lowest position would mean acting strategically, maybe patiently documenting the injustice, building support networks quietly, or using nonviolent resistance.
That's it, exactly. Think of the Salt March in India, or the lunch counter sit-ins in the civil rights movement. These are strategies of incredible non-egoic power. They refused to engage in the dualistic narrative of violence, of coercive power, but they were absolutely not passive.
No.
They were strategic, patient, and highly effective because they were acting from humility and alignment. They forced the aggressor to react against a profound lack of resistance.
This ability to yield without collapsing, to take that lowest position without dissolving into fear, It must come from a source of identity that isn't dependent on defense.
Yes.
And this is where that non-dual realization of the true self becomes absolutely essential.
Correct. Mystics like Joel Goldsmith referred to the true self, the Atman, or Christ consciousness, as the fourth element. The big realization is that the true self is already fully present. It is the universal I am that remains when the illusion of separation dissolves.
So the problem isn't a lack of spiritual status or that we need to, climb some ladder to reach God. The problem is what you call the cloud model of identity.
The cloud model suggests that the true self is like the sun, shining brilliantly and constantly. The cloud is the complex structure of belief in a separate, fragile, deficient ego. The sun isn't obscured by a lack of status, but by the presence of the cloud. The true self is 100% present right now, just waiting to be recognized.
This radically reinterprets the command attributed to Jesus to deny himself.
Right.
It's not about masochism or self-flagellation.
Not at all. It is the negation of identification with the false self. It's the direct equivalent of neti, not this, not that. In Vedanta, you observe every thought, every feeling, every boundary, and you say, neti, I am not this, separate me. What remains when that cloud of identification is negated is the universal I am.
And that ties directly back to the image of the vine and the branches. I am the vine, you are the branches. Without me, you can do nothing. Mm-hmm. The branch realizes its life is the vine's life, the Christ, the logos. True power flows when the branch stops trying to bear fruit through its own willpower because it recognizes that its life force is this non-dual dependency.
The individual self realizes its life isn't self-generated. It's a focused expression of the universal life. The separate self cannot truly resolve friction. It can only manage it, postpone it, or externalize it. True resolution has to flow from that deeper, unified place.
Which brings us to the culmination of this whole path, Wu Wei, effortless flow. This is the state where turn the other cheek stops being a rule you have to follow and starts being a natural response.
Yes. Wu Wei, which is often translated as non-forced action, is the maturation of the cross practice. It's the shift from conscious strategy to total spontaneous responsiveness. When you are operating from the I am, action no longer comes from the separate ego trying to manage the external world.
It just flows.
It flows effortlessly and spontaneously from the universal consciousness, from the Tao.
The locus of agency shifts completely. It's the universe acting through the individual.
In the Wu Wei state, there's no separation between intention and action. It's like a master musician playing a piece they wrote. They aren't consciously deciding which key to hit next. The music just flows through them. They are fully aligned with the pattern, the logos, and animated by the flow, the spirit.
And this is how friction gets resolved in real time. Because if that separate self is gone, there's no repository for resentment. There's nowhere for the conflict to stick.
That is the key feature. In the earlier stages, carrying the cross, you accumulate friction, and you spend effort processing it. In the Wu Wei state, friction is integrated the instant it arises. There's no isolated ego to bear the burden or store the resentment, or feel existentially threatened by the conflict. The moment of tension is absorbed instantly into the larger flow. It dissolves the cross into its function.
Which means that wisdom turning the other cheek, yielding the cloak, it's no longer a difficult moral mandate. It becomes the simple path of least resistance. It's the natural behavior of someone who is aligned with the inherent unity of the operating system.
If we loop all the way back to our metaphysical blueprint, the action in Wu Wei isn't coming from you, the separate branch. It's coming from the universal I am, the pattern. The logos flowing through the spirit, the dynamic flow. It's perfect, effortless unity with the source, the Father. The struggle stops because the universe is acting through you, and you cannot ultimately resist yourself. You are the wave that finally realizes it is the ocean.
That is a powerful synthesis. I mean, we started with what sounded like impossible, naive advice, a recipe for being a doormat, and we've ended up with an evolutionary blueprint that connects mystical philosophy with the deep structure of world religions and gives a clear developmental path for the individual.
To briefly recap the journey for you, we established 3 core insights. First, that esoteric spiritual advice is fundamentally a description of a future evolutionary state of unity consciousness. It's not a prescriptive set of rules for our current fragmented present.
Right.
Second, we saw that the world's conflict and suffering are functional. They serve as the necessary friction, the engine required for collective and individual development to happen freely.
And third, we map that practical path, moving from the conscious ethical work of carrying the cross-integrating friction on a daily basis to the effortless, spontaneous alignment of wu-wei, where action flows from the true self, the universal I am, which is already fully present, just obscured by the cloud of the separate ego.
The work, then, is not to gain something new. It's to surrender the fiction of separation.
And I think we should end on that profound note, that the cross is scaffolding and not the final structure. So here's a final provocative thought for you to carry forward, something for you to mull over in your own life this week. If every challenge, every irritation, every moment of tension you face today is not an obstacle blocking your way, but rather the essential necessary friction required to refine and solidify your consciousness, what tension are you currently carrying that might actually be preparing you to step out of the scaffolding and into the effortless flow of your true self?